welcome everybody. My name is John Arthos. And if this is your first time here, welcome to the Hermeneutics in Real Life project. This is this new online project. We have our first year. This is the last discussion of our first year of programming. This project is trying to introduce hermeneutics to a larger audience by showing its relevance to our everyday lives. And we encourage you to explore all the cool stuff that Fernando has put up on the site, and feel free to, suggest future initiatives to us. I'm actually going to post, this is kind of exciting for us. We've put together next year's program, which is a brand new format, and I will share the topics. You're looking at them now. So in September, the topic will be the task of educators in a time of war. And I'll just read down the list. Digital humanities is an oxymoron. Schooling on race, gender, and sexual orientation. The future of money. Vocation and the crisis of the humanities. We're looking at all of these topics through a hermeneutic lens. So we will be sharing much more information about that as we put that together. So stay tuned about that. We're very excited to get that moving next year, starting in the fall. Now, finally, I would like to introduce our guest speaker for today. We're enormously privileged to have Joseph Edelheit today. A rabbi emeritus professor of religious and Jewish studies at St. Cloud State University. He served on President Bill Clinton's Presidential Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS from 1995 to 2000. He received a Doctor of Ministry at the University of Chicago Theology Divinity School. And point of personal privilege, he did his BA in rhetoric at UC Berkeley back in the day. He has 3 books, in addition to his many essays and book chapters. Co-editor of Reading Scripture, again with Paul Ricoeur, and also of the forthcoming anthology from Lexington, Refiguring the Sacred, Conversations with Paul Ricoeur, which I'm really excited to be able to read. I hope you can talk to us about this. And then his monograph, What Am I Missing? Questions About Being Human. Today, Joseph's topic is anti-Semitism and a hermeneutics of renewal of Ricoeur's warning. This discussion, as you saw when you came on, is being recorded for people who couldn't make it. Our format is that Joseph will speak for about 20 minutes, followed by a Q&A, which is why we call this a discussion. And the way we do that is, if you will please cue your questions in the chat, and that's how I will moderate. I'll call on people and try to recognize folks who haven't been on the site before. We would ask you to please mute your cell phone and your Zoom speaker if you're not speaking. And so then, without further ado, I would like to introduce Joseph. Welcome, Joseph.
Thank you, John, and thank you to the Hermeneutics in Real Life group for inviting me. To discuss anti-Semitism, the oldest prejudice, bigotry, hatred, I suggest we first engage in the hermeneutic necessity of prejudice. Among Gadamer's foundational ideas, quote, "It is our prejudices that constitute our being. Prejudices are not necessarily unjustified and erroneous, so that they inevitably distort the truth. In fact, the historicity of our existence entails that prejudices, in the literal sense of the word, constitute the initial directness of our whole ability to experience." Richard Bernstein notes, "Understanding is only possible because of the prejudices and prejudgments that are constitutive of what we are, our own historicity. When I was 7 years old, it was the first time I was called a Christ killer. My neighbor had come back from catechism. I had gone to ask if we could play baseball, and he said, "I can't play ball with you anymore. You killed Christ." That was in 1953. It was transformative. I didn't know Christ, but I was sure that I hadn't killed him. Over the years, I would experience anti-Semitism and increasingly understand myself not as a victim, but as someone drawn to understand why someone else would say that. Went to the University of California at Berkeley in the 60s, chose to go to the Hebrew Union College to become a rabbi, and increasingly I became committed to interfaith dialogue that had begun at Berkeley. It was sustained during the seminary. And when I was a rabbi in Michigan City, Indiana, I was drawn to a request to teach at Valparaiso University. Let me note that introduction to Jim Moore. Please join me in congratulating his completion of 42 years of serving Valpo. He is retiring at the end of next week when he grades. That introduction led me to meeting David Tracy at IU, which led me to accepting Tracy's invitation to the Div School, where I met Paul Ricoeur. That's how I came to be a part of this society. I did not go to the divinity school to get a PhD to become an academic. I went to the divinity school 10 years after I was ordained a rabbi in order to learn more for the dialogues I knew I needed as a rabbi. For reasons of health, I retired from the pulpit rabbinate, finished my doctorate, and chose to take an academic position at a school that had already settled a federal class action lawsuit on anti-Semitism. I was invited by the State Attorney General of Minnesota to help foster a Jewish studies program at St. Cloud State as part of that settlement. There are no Jews at St. Cloud State, less than 10. This all leads back to this conversation: hermeneutics in real life. The most recent data from the Anti-Defamation League shows that in 2021, there was more anti-Semitism than ever before measured in the United States. A global audit done by the University of Tel Aviv shows increasing anti-Semitism, violence, harassment, graffiti, and online than ever before measured. Quote, "This data results from the strengthening in some countries of the radical populist right and the anti-Zionist radical left. COVID-19 angst, economic hardships, unleashed voices of hatred and prejudice. So did the conflict in Gaza in May 2021. Social media, with echo chambers that cultivate, popularize destructive conspiracy theories. The fight against anti-Semitism enjoys considerable funding today. There is no shortage of organizations, seminars, conferences, but the data presented in all reports suggests that despite all these efforts, something has gone terribly wrong. I will be leaving links to both audits on the website. There is an irony you should note. Global Jewish population data was released the day before the anti-Semitism data. There are today 15.2 million Jews in a global population of 7.9 billion. In 1939, there were 16.6 million Jews in a global population of 2 billion. Today, Jews comprise 0.19% of all people, yet Jew hatred is the single greatest category of religious hatred attributed in North America. There are so many headlines from the last just 2 weeks. I share only two. Anti-Semitism increased under Trump and then it got worse. Op-ed, New York Times. Jonathan Greenblatt, national director of the ADL, argues that more than 80% of the incidents documented cannot be attributed to any specific extremist group or movement. Much of the threat to Jews in America seems to come less from distinct particular ideology than from the broader cultural breakdown that's leading to an increase in all manner of antisocial behavior. The Atlantic, what the New Yorker didn't say about a famous writer's anti-Semitism. Why are Alice Walker's vile beliefs about Jews treated so gently? Speaking of Alice Walker's poetry, here are 2 lines from her 2017 poem, "It is our frightful duty to study the Talmud. Are goyim, us, meant to be slaves of Jews? And not only that, but to enjoy it." How anti-Semitic is Alice Walker? The New Yorker might have asked. The straightforward answer is very, very anti-Semitic. It's in this environment, audits and the press, that I ask that we reread Paul Ricoeur's sermon given 33 years ago at Emmanuel congregation in Chicago, where I was the rabbi. And I invited him to preach on Yom HaShoah, a Sabbath set aside for the Holocaust memorial. That was only 10 days ago, by the way, in the Jewish calendar. I often invited Christians to preach on that day because I believe it's necessary for the Jewish community to learn the dialogue needed to share the meaning of the Shoah. This paragraph, prescient, prophetic, 33 years ago. This danger of banality may be greater today than the danger of sheer forgetfulness. Historians, sociologists, and economists may claim to explain the tragedy so thoroughly that it becomes merely one case of barbarism among others. Even worse, an alleged full explanation may make the event appear as necessary to the extent that the causes, whether economical, political, psychological, or religious, would be held to exhaust the meaning of the event. The task of memory is to preserve the scandalous dimension of the event, to leave that which is monstrous inexhaustible by explanation. Thanks to the memory and to the narratives which preserve this memory, the uniqueness of the horrible, the uniqueness, if I dare say so, is prevented from being leveled off by explanation. Ricoeur could not have imagined the possibility that the foreign minister of the Federation of Russia would say on Italian live TV, justifying the attack on the Ukraine of neo-Nazis, knowing the president of Ukraine is Jewish, saying Hitler had a Jewish father. In fact, the most ardent anti-Semites are usually Jews. This is the banalization of the lie of anti-Semites since the beginning. We Jews hate ourselves the most. I gave 2 essays by Dara Horn from her new collection, People Love Dead Jews, Reports from a Haunted Present. These essays, Dara Horn is a novelist and an academic, having taught at Harvard and Yeshiva University, PhD in Yiddish and Hebrew literature. She describes going to an Auschwitz exhibit in New York. Going to these new exhibitions was predictably wrenching, but there was also something hopeful about them, sponsored almost entirely by Jewish philanthropists and nonprofit groups. These museums were imbued with a kind of optimism, a bedrock assumption that they were, for the lack of a better word, effective. The idea was that people would come to these museums and learn what the world had done to Jews, where hatred can lead. They would then stop hating Jews. It's not a ridiculous idea, but it seems to have proved wrong. She writes, in this newest Auschwitz exhibition, something has shifted. The New York display originated not from Jews trying to underwrite a better future, but from a corporation, a for-profit Spanish company whose business is blockbuster museum shows. For instance, the very successful Human Bodies, which consisted of cross-sectioned, colorfully dyed cadavers, sourced, it was later revealed, from the Chinese government, that aimed to teach visitors about anatomy and science. Its other wildly popular show about the Titanic. This is, of course, not a disaster porn company, but an educational company. And who could argue against education? 600,000 people had seen the exhibition during its 6 months in Madrid before New York. The Auschwitz exhibition was produced in cooperation with the Auschwitz Site Museum in Poland, carefully curated by diligent historians who are world-renowned experts. The Auschwitz exhibition is everything an Auschwitz exhibition should be. Ricoeur warned us, the task of memory is to preserve the scandalous dimension of the event, to leave that which is monstrous, inexhaustible by explanation. So I asked, hermeneutics in real life, if Auschwitz can be commercialized, commodified in the name of education, have we now conceded the task of memory to preserve the scandalous and monstrous hatred of dead Jews? But then, hence, the hatred of living Jews can simply become normative. Horn's initial article in the Smithsonian about the iconic universal example of Anne Frank. She writes, here's how much people love dead Jews. Anne Frank's diary, first published in Dutch, 1947, from her surviving father, has been translated into 70 languages, sold over 30 million copies, and the Anne Frank House now hosts well over 1 million visitors each year. with reserve tickets selling out months in advance. But when a young employee at the Anne Frank House in 2017 tried to wear a yarmulke, kippah, to work, his employers told him to hide it under a baseball cap. The museum's managing director told newspapers that a live Jew in a yarmulke might interfere with the museum's independent position. The museum finally relented after deliberating for 6 months, which seems like a rather long time for the Anne Frank House to ponder whether it was a good idea to force a Jew into hiding. The line most people know from the Anne Frank diary: in spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. It's often called inspiring, by which we mean that it flatters us. It makes us feel forgiven for those lapses of our civilization that allow for piles of murdered girls. And if those words come from a murdered girl, well, then we must be absolved, because that must be true. That gift of grace and absolution from a murdered Jew, exactly that gift is worth noting at the heart of Christianity, is what millions of people were so eager to find in Frank's hiding place, in her writings, in her legacy. And Horn concludes, it is far more gratifying to believe that an innocent dead girl has offered us grace than to recognize the obvious. Frank wrote about people being truly good at heart 3 weeks before she met people who weren't. Thanks to the memory, Ricoeur writes, and to the narratives which preserve this memory, the uniqueness of the horrible, the uniqueness, if I dare say so, is prevented from being leveled off by explanation. Ricoeur reminds his listeners, this was a sermon he gave from my pulpit to a Sabbath congregation when he was present as a Christian survivor POW from World War II. But he came to witness an event, and he confesses its uniqueness. Universalizing the Holocaust, its victims, its testimonies, yes, even its memories, is now acknowledged as anti-Semitic erasure, which Ricoeur notes in his sermon as killing the victims again. The function of memory is not only to register past events, but to stimulate human conscience. Raphael Lemkin, the lawyer who coined the idiom genocide, created the category for the world. Those words he wrote in his autobiography. The past, that crime is derived from the past genocide and is defined by its own history, but it is a warning about the future. I have examples of hermeneutics in real life. Jewish-Christian relations are at an all-time low. Yehuda Kurtzer, US president of the Shalom Hartman Institute. Hermeneutics in real life, our political discourse and relationships. Jeffrey Leffler, professor of history from the University of Virginia, his insights into the trial of the Charlottesville. But I want to conclude with the purpose of initiating this topic among those who study and teach hermeneutics. Why did I bring this? As a statement of gratitude to my teacher and my friend Paul Ricoeur, who decided to be fully present in my synagogue and to remind all of us that his ideas were always linked to his behavior. Eugene Borowitz, a great covenantal theologian, his writings I gave to Paul. In 1964, Borowitz led a group of rabbis to share with Martin Luther King, St. Augustine, Florida, civil rights. He later wrote about the event. We came because we could not stand silently by our brother's blood. We had done that too many times before. We have been vocal in exhortation of others, but the idleness of our hands too often revealed an inner silence. Silence at a time when silence has become the unpardonable sin of our time. We came in hope that God, the God of all of us, would accept our small involvement as partial atonement for the many things we wish we had done before and often. We came as Jews because we remember the millions of faceless people who stood quietly watching the smoke rise from Hitler's crematoria. We came because we know that second only to silence, the greatest danger to humanity is loss of faith in humankind's capacity to act. These words are foundational to my theology, to my real life hermeneutics, and the sense of justice. These words are why I invited Paul Ricoeur to my synagogue. I knew that he too would not be silent. Can we still hear him?
Thank you very much.
I will post the text, which I adapted. I left out some material in order to make sure I didn't breach the covenant of 20 minutes, which I already did. So there are other elements, but I want the conversation.
And I should say that Fernando has posted links to some of the documents and links that that Joseph referenced in his presentation as well. Yeah, so I think if we can do this, rather than raising your digital hand, if you could write your name in the chat if you'd like to ask a question, or if you'd like to just write your question, either way, and that way I can see clearly who would like to ask a question. Okay, so we can start then, because I see, Steve, you have a question. And don't forget to unmute.
Joseph, can you hear me?
I can, Steve. It's good to see you. How are you?
Good to see you too. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Not only intellectually stimulating presentation, but also the underlying emotional effect of it. So here's my question. As a fellow rhetorician, I was quite taken by your opening, which first hermeneutically grounded your presentation with your reference to Gadamer on the necessity of prejudice, and then introduced your comments with a biographical reference to your first experience of anti-Semitic prejudice. My question is, what are we to make of this opening juxtaposition? The hermeneutic necessity of prejudice, and then the lived experience of a prejudice that has had such horrific historical effects. Are these two opening moments meant to be in tension, or are they somehow, in your view, complementary?
They were meant. I rewrote the opening 4 times. Look, at least with Tracy required us to read as much Winnicott as we could cope with in order to understand paradox is the tipping point of hermeneutics. So yes, Gadamer is correct. Prejudice is constitutive to my historicity. I came to the divinity school to learn more about Christian theology. I did not come to study Judaism, came to study Christian theology so that I could be present to a Christian in dialogue, understanding the paradox of what they said out of their scripture. I went to Catholic churches to be present when they would walk with the Bible, they would sit during the Old Testament and stand during Christian scripture, New Testament. My dialogue has always been, and my oldest dialogue partner's on the screen, Jim Moore, ordained Lutheran minister. He can tell you that I was hounded out of the chapel at Valpo for being disallowed as a preacher. So I engage the paradox as the very grist of the to and fro, which Gadamer, Ricoeur want us to be in.
Thank you very much.
Richard, would you like to ask a question?
Sorry, I was muted. Great to see you again, Joseph. Hey, let me share my first experience of anti-Semitism. I'm still waiting for it at 75 years old. And I'm either, naive or oblivious or lucky. I'm not sure which. But in recent times, Tree of Life shooting, and then what happened in Dallas, here in Florida, in our synagogue, for the first one, we had a memorial, if you will, a vigil, where our synagogue was absolutely packed with people from this community in every single religion. And then again, in what happened in, was it Fort Worth, Dallas, I'm not sure, we had another vigil that was full of people. It was a Zoom vigil of people in our community from other faiths. So my question is, does that lead to a sense of hopefulness that there are other liberal-minded, open-minded, fair-minded people in this world? Or is it just a trap that leads to complacency?
Thank you, Richard. Look, I have had several experiences of anti-Semitism, and I've had many, many, many more experiences of being engaged with hope and grace. I'm approaching the 49th anniversary of my ordination. I had a career sustained by the grace you described. However, the data suggests that in the midst of this grace, there is more violence, more harassment. If you had told me and I have some rabbinic colleagues who came to hear, if you had told a rabbi in the seminary, we're going to give you training from the FBI on how to save your life and the lives of others in a live moment hostage crisis. Well, the rabbi in Colleyville received that training, and he knew what to do. When I heard him give a lecture about what he knew what to do, I started to cry, but wondering what it would be like to have that training. I've let strangers into the synagogue in the middle of a service. Look, this is not either or, it's both and. Hatred of people because of their race, their orientation, is in a world filled with grace. It's why I continue annually to offer a Jewish-Christian dialogue in the middle of the Society for Ricoeur Studies.
I see that Jeffrey has a question.
So many people are horrified, and tragically, there is still a hardcore group of people who are not horrified. They are justified.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, Jeffrey.
Of course, thanks for the provocation. Two thoughts. I think the paradox that you're pointing out speaks to the question of the invitation to speak provokes shame. And it's not clear what happens if we are provoking shame. Shame leads to perpetual silence. And so that back and forth paradox doesn't seem to have a resolution by simply inviting the speaking and the seeing, a la the Frank House. The other thought, even more disturbing, is that Winnicott argued that part of the therapeutic process is the clinician surviving the murderous rage of
Yes.
the patient, and that ultimately the core of the treatment is the endurance of the clinician to tolerate the hatred and not retaliate. And so I'm not sure where that leaves us.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I didn't quote you or Winnicott when I was held in contempt by the federal court. I had been at St. Cloud State, and the settlement required a public training of all faculty and staff. And the provost and president were told by the federal court, you have to do that within 90 days. And they assigned that task to me. And I said at a faculty meeting, it will shame people to be required to come. This was before DEI programs. It will shame people to be told they must come to a anti-Semitism training. One of the last named plaintiffs of the class sued me directly. And I was taken to the federal court. Magistrate, who used to be a member of my synagogue, put me in his chambers. I was, how shall I put this? I was stupidly sarcastic when I asked the magistrate, should I put the most anti-Semitic people in the first 3 rows so I can know to whom I'm speaking? He said, I have profoundly listened to you when you're in your sanctuary. Now you're in my sanctuary and you'll listen to me. There is a risk that people will be shamed. This is part of the settlement of a federal class action lawsuit. You are required to do it. And if you don't, I will hold you personally in contempt. The following was created as an hour-and-a-half anti-Semitism training that took a whole day. I used the word Jew as a verb because it's something people in Minnesota, especially rural Minnesota, use all the time. I could really Jew him down. It is the only proper noun that I could find then in the Oxford English Dictionary that's used as a transitive verb that is considered obscene. So we staged conversation points around the verb Jew. A week before I retired in June 2016, 2 people came up to me and said, now that you're retiring, we want to tell you what it was like to be shamed by you in public when you challenged our use of the word to Jew someone. So Jeffrey, I understand and agree with you. My answer to Steve was an honest one about the nature of the necessity of prejudice and the transformative experience of anti-Semitism as a prejudice in my life. I don't want it to be a murderous paradox, but I think even in this group at this moment, I can't imagine anyone is neutral about this topic. Everybody on this screen has had a relationship with this topic, either in Jews they've known, scripture, experiences of being present. So what do we do as hermeneutes, as thinkers, as teachers, with something we've experienced? Is anti-Semitism a problem that is solely within the Jewish community? Is this something that really belongs to all of us? In the same way, we are now coping again fundamentally with issues of racism, or this past week with issues of women and their freedom to make choices for themselves. So, yes, Jeffrey, I think this remains a set of questions caught in paradoxes that have not been answered for more than 2,000 years.
Dan, I see that you have an excellent question in the chat. Would you like to extemp on that a bit?
Okay, just briefly. Hi, Joseph, thank you. You've raised a great challenge to kind of be summarized. Things are worse than we thought and they're getting worse. And I was struck by, at one point you implied kind of the failure of a museum, failure of telling history, and then a failure of telling stories through the Anne Frank example. It's somewhat contrasted with the positive personal relationship and the impact of that with you and Paul Ricoeur. And I was just thinking all of these are seen as ways to succeed, and yet in a sense they failed. And I just wonder if you would talk about the relative value of those different ways, history, story, personal relationships, with a little bit of an idea of what is the way forward.
Well, our relationship, Dan, is an example of how I think this society stimulates ongoing personal and communal knowledge. I would not use the word failure. Conversations don't end. There are gaps in them, lapses in them. Jeffrey's note of shame, there's an awkward moment. I thought long and hard about offering this topic to this group. That in and of itself was a risk. Does it belong in this group? Is this a philosophical topic? Is this a topic that those of you who have full-time still teaching gigs, you are living this topic on campuses where issues around Israel are raised? What if you're in a school, as you were, Dan, as Jim was, where there are no Jews? There's an absence of Jews. Do you become then a resource for explaining? This Bible is called the Hebrew Bible. It's not called the Old Testament. It's called the Hebrew Bible because it continues then to grant the ongoing relationship that the Jewish community has with Scripture. If you call it old, that means it's now succeeded by a new, better one. Maybe that simple statement changes the way someone approaches a Jew, the Jewish community. I know because I've had private conversations with many of the people on the screen who are not among my friends who gathered today. I think that the Recourse Society, Hermeneutics in Real Life, is more than an academic group. These are thinkers willing to take chances to talk about what thinking in life risks mean. You introduced me to someone who did a podcast. He had no relationship with me, Jews per se. He created a podcast that introduced me as a Jew, certainly not representing the whole Jewish community, to others. It's a nature of expanding the risks of conversation. Well, one of the reasons Jim and I continue ad nauseum to offer a dialogue to the society is to model what we experience as the necessity of dialogue. I spoke to one of his classes, kind of as a gift, his closing gig, and one of his students said, wow, not only did I never meet a rabbi before, I actually saw the way a dialogue can work. I think that we're living in a world right now where we're having fewer and fewer and fewer dialogues. Not just interfaith. Hermeneutics is about the to and fro. It's inside the to and fro that understanding happens. So, yes, it's getting worse. I would say the most dangerous thing I want to convey is it has become normative. What does that mean?
Joseph, I have, and I think this may be our last question. I have a question from Tom that I'm going to read to you. And Tom says, thank you for this presentation. And would you summarize your interpretation of why anti-Semitism, especially the why of anti-Semitism, especially its uniqueness, how you distinguish anti-Semitism from reactions to Islam, to LGBTQ plus prejudice, etc.
Well, I created a course called Anti-Semitism in America. I don't want to teach the class, but Tom, anti-Semitism is the oldest consistent textual hatred. There is an anti-Jewish polemic created inside Christian scripture. When you say, as Lavrov did last week, Jews are the worst anti-Semites. They hate themselves the most. I could go back and trace the way Christian scripture deals with Judas. And from Judas, we could chart the etymology of the word Jew. Look, we are living in a dominant Christian Western culture. Issues of Islam, LGBTQ, trans, issues of women, they all have their own historical anchors, philosophically, sociologically, and textually. But this is the oldest. I don't accept Jesus of Nazareth as the Messiah. There must be something wrong with me, because Catholic with a small c means universal. So if it's universal and he's risen and I say no thank you, there can't be a problem with the message. There's got to be a problem with the person who says no thank you. And so here we are.
It's interestingly enough, Joseph, the chat queue is filling up. So I will tell everyone a little clue here. If you go down to the bottom right of your screen under the chat, you'll see three little dots. And if you click on those three dots, it allows you to save the chat. And so, Joseph, if you would like to memorialize these questions, you could actually continue that conversation with folks.
Yeah, I don't know where those three little dots are, but if you or Fernando could copy them, I will engage them.
Okay. All right. So I've already done that, and I will do that. So then, if we could all once again thank Joseph for this extremely moving and stimulating conversation and talk with us.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you very, very much.
Yes,
Thank
such an important topic for you to engage us with. Yes.